That said, I'm now I have the pleasure of introducing our last speakers for today. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. So I'll start with Tara Connolly, and Tara is amazing. She's joined us on an upcoming television show we have called The Outlook. And she was very patient as I mismanaged my questions. She's been, you were a star, Tara. I just looked at the footage, you're amazing. Tara is a transition specialist with 20 years of experience working with and learning from adults and youth on the autism spectrum. Her work is focused on facilitating neurodiverse thinkers to thrive on their own terms through co-creating meaningful transitions into and throughout adulthood, including employment. She's worked as a teacher, an autism spectrum disorder consultant with the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, an autism spectrum disorder content expert with the Public Health Agency of Canada, and a counselor in private practice. She was instrumental in designing the Transition Support Center at Algonquin College, a service that supports the transition of students on the spectrum into post-secondary education. Tara earned a master's in sociology and equity studies from the University of Toronto and is a member of the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association and the College of Registered Psychotherapists. Just saying that a little bit more slowly so our interpreter can sign it. Welcome, Tara. We're also joined by Jess Mitchell. And Jess, I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years, and I'm a huge fan. Jess is Senior Manager of Research and Design at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University. Which, and I love Jess's bio, and I'm going to be copying this format, which is a meaningless title that tells you virtually nothing about her. Here's what you need to know. Jess is often a misfit, values a critical perspective, and she appreciates the messy parts of human interaction. She's also one of the kindest and brightest people I've ever met, and she has a fondness for things in threes and a background in ethics. So thank you both for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you. And why don't we kick this off with Jess, you can give us a start.
Okay, sorry about that. Wasn't sure, it's holding back. I'm just gonna share my screen. I wanna talk about a few things and I wanna sort of lead us through the conversation together. And then Tara is gonna do a little presentation and then the two of us are gonna have a chit chat. My voice doesn't always sound like this. I have a cold, so I apologize for the audio. This is a definition of this is the definition that we use for inclusive design. It's design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and any other form of human difference. And designing inclusively results in better experiences for everyone. I want to suggest that any decision we make is a design decision. To choose this and not anything else is to decide, to be a decider about how someone will experience or interact with something. So inclusive design is basically relevant in everything we do. If you're in a conversation where often millions of decisions are made, the ways that we hold ourselves, the ways that we speak up, how we listen or don't, how aggressive we are, or how welcoming we are and when, who we're kind to, policy making, what is behind the policy, who made the policy and for whom, who is represented in the policy, who stands to gain, who stands to lose. We can only work from home now. Plenty of employers said that that was not something that was possible until COVID. When we're making products, who did we think about when we made this? If you're a 26-year-old in the Bay Area making a digital product, are you thinking about the 65-year-old in Thunder Bay and how she'll use it? Space making, who's welcome? Who is this intended for? What is this intended for? Which time zone do we choose for our global meeting? Who speaks first in the meeting? Who has great ideas in the moment versus a few hours later? And which do we value? Which do we accommodate? So I want to suggest that all of us have a responsibility and opportunity. If you make decisions, yes, you're a designer. You're deciding this one thing and not anything else. And you might have reasons. They might range from that's the way we always do it to that's the way the person before me did it, to because I said so, or because research says it's good for the majority. If you make decisions that affect another person, then you're a designer. One of the places you can start to interrogate this and understand what you're doing and how you're doing it is to ask, what decisions do I make? You might make a policy. You might make some small decisions. You might make very big decisions. The question is, do you know how to do that inclusively? So, have you ever made decisions based on popularity? Like word clouds have a tendency to make bigger than the words that are most popular. When we use software for Q&A in online sessions, they have a tendency to give you an opportunity to upvote a question. Popularity wins, but it often creates an echo chamber. Numbers win. We often reference the majority and the needs of the majority as proving something. We talk about bang for your buck. So we're thinking of it in terms of economics and markets. Sometimes we use something called the 80-20 rule, where we spend our time worrying about 80% of the people who have an easier time with whatever it is that's produced, rather than the 20% of the people who spend a disproportionate amount of time trying to use it. So we do things like accommodations. I'm going to suggest if you get to the point of accommodations, you've already failed to do inclusive design.
Mm-hmm.
You might say we can't make everyone happy. Well, I don't think that's true. I think we have to explore who are we trying to make happy. When we look at decisions, oftentimes, contemporarily, data-driven decisions are popular. We need to ask whose data, who paid for the data. We need to follow the money. And we need to realize and recognize that we are deferring to something disembodied to make our decisions. The data is acting like tea leaves for decision making, the map for change, the path toward enlightenment. Even toward innovation, we look for data. Data looks backwards, though. It looks at what happened before. It doesn't look at what could happen in the future. This is why things like COVID-19 snuck up on us in ways that it probably shouldn't have. So we need to critique these little quips, bang for your buck, numbers win. And we need to think about data not as pure mountain streams or definitive or clean. We need to think about it as something that requires interpretation. So ask you if any of these things appear in your workspaces. Power asymmetries, racial dynamics, mental health considerations, other challenges. They're often neglected by designers. And I'll go ahead and answer for you now. These things show up wherever people show up. And so in inclusive design, we concern ourselves with form and function. The way things begin matters. Each decision is a design decision, and those have a deep impact on how we function in spaces, literal spaces, virtual spaces, and conceptual spaces too. So we look at a space like this. This room is very neat. Notice the old growth forest table, the uniform, serious high-back chairs, the symmetry of it all. This communicates serious people convene here, deciders. This is where they meet and make decisions. Deciders belong here. I was in a meeting room like this, and I sat in the chair, the power chair. It was the chair that the minister usually sat in. I knew that. People filed in for a meeting, and unbeknownst to any one of them individually, all the men sat on the left side and all the women sat on the right side. And opposite me was a young woman sitting in what was usually the secretary's chair, the person who takes the notes. When I mentioned to everybody that we had assembled that way, they seemed horrified. None of them individually made that decision, but something happened that resulted in that. So I think we need to tune in to the ways that we are influenced by the things around us. And one of the ways that I like to encourage us to do that is by thinking about how form begets function. Architecturally, experientially, and interactionally. I'm only going to go through a few examples here, but quite literally everything we do. We can design a store that leads you through in a particular manner, encourages you to spend more time somewhere and less time somewhere else. Just think about all the candy bars at the checkout counter. My son likes to think about the candy bars at the checkout counter. What are you supposed to do in a space like this? Chairs all lined up, symmetry in rows, all pointing at one person standing on the stage. This is a conference. What are you supposed to do here? Sit passively and listen. How can we question this and say, is this the best way to share? And then look at something like this, which is the Indigenous Storytelling Circle and Sharing Circle of the Indigenous Advisory Group at the Thunder Bay Public Library in Ontario. Cross-generational group sitting in a circle, sharing objects in the middle together. Not choosing one way of doing things, choosing many ways of doing things. And then in the history of work, the cubicle was a big innovation in our offices, in our spaces where we work. This was the answer to scale and equality. This is sameness, equality, not equity. Everybody had a little box, a computer, a chair, 3 walls. They were indistinguishable from each other. This, we thought, was a level playing field. And now this is the space where we collaborate. This is a Zoom, this is a Google image search for Zoom meeting. We build ourselves into little boxes. We mute our voices, horrifying feminists everywhere. We disengage our gaze. We don't look at people. We wind up looking at ourselves. This is the digital space we work in. And then we have counter examples like the City Hall in the city of London, UK. It's built as a circle. It has spaces for ramps and lifts. It has changing places, toilet for people with complex disabilities. It has sign language interpreters, induction loops, tactile maps, and a mental health space for anybody who needs a moment. You see, design has this unique ability to dignify. It can make people feel valued, respected, honored, and seen. And this is both the opportunity and responsibility of design. So design can say, you belong here. This is meant for you. Come on in. You're welcome. We thought of you from the beginning. It can also say you don't belong here in very subtle ways, or explicit. This was not meant for you. You're not welcome. We didn't think of you from the beginning, and we aren't putting value in thinking of you. You see, we're in a bit of conflict. We like the idea of creating safe spaces, but we know we need to be pushed outside of our comfort zone. We know culture fit isn't often diverse or inclusive, but we hire for it, and we sit comfortably in that space creating monocultures. We like stability, but we know to innovate or to grow, we need to change. We want to be the best, but we know that we speak about the value of collaboration. We want to win, but we also want to cooperate. We create an us to build a community, but our community also defines a them in the negative space. We want to be positive, inspirational, exciting, but we know that many of us learn from the negative experiences, in some cases much more, if we allow ourselves to have them. So how do we reconcile these things? There are no black or white answers here. These are false binaries. We need both, and we need to understand that we are in the nuance, and we need to explore that space together. We need to explore it in our methods as well, the quantitative, the qualitative, and the anecdotal. We do damage when we succumb to, without questioning, the naturalized and adopted methods. When we stick to the statistical results instead of looking at inspirational stories or both. When we limit ourselves to a set of questions instead of exploring through dialogue. When we talk about reported life rather than real life. When things are out of context rather than in context. We hear about issues versus surrounding ourselves with people who experience issues. In this word validate, I'm not sure what we're doing. I like exploring much more. You see, we get it wrong. We think it's yes or no, black or white, good or bad, fair or unfair, right or wrong, neat or messy, truth or lies. But the truth is, the world is complex, and as one of the previous speakers said, intersectional. We're all complex, each of us, and to put us all together, it's even more complex. These are false binaries. So what I want to suggest is that what you measure is what you value. Do you measure things like number of clients, profit, success, as in the absence of failure, completion, diversity? And really, what does that give you if those are the things that you measure? And we know that you measure what you value. So we have a tendency to measure things that are measurable easily. And then they perpetuate themselves, don't they? Do you measure any of these things? A sense of urgency, creativity, teamwork, unselfish giving, grace and dignity, optimism, active listening, critical thinking, curiosity, humility, judgment, positivity, a bias toward results, and inclusion. These are a mixture of things that would be desirable and undesirable in certain circumstances. The context matters. So what you measure is what you value. How you measure it is your bias, and what you do with it is your design decision. And your design decisions are sniffable. We can see it from the outside. This is something that I created a few years ago. It might be a little bit divisive. I appropriated the word wokeness and I called it the Wokeness Scale. This is diversity, equity, and inclusion within human resources and what is visible. On the left is less woke. On the right, we might call woke AF. Hope you know what that means. The where If you find diversity and inclusion in HR, or do you find it in some departments? Maybe there's an ally program, or maybe it's embedded in everything that the company does. It's inextricable from anything. The what, maybe it happens as events, maybe voluntary workshops, maybe it's mandatory training, or maybe it's embedded in job descriptions, hiring practices, onboarding, training. It's continuous, it's never done. And how much? Is it measured as demographic data? Does it move beyond the token? Is it incorporating diversity of thought and experience? And is it measured as your full self? Who has a picture of their family on their desk? Or your employee resource groups, do they get paid for their time, for their experience? You measure what you value, you pay for what you value. So inclusion, it isn't ever complete. It has to be a value, never a checklist. As Florence Kennedy said about freedom, it's like taking a bath. You got to keep doing it every day, or every other day if you have dry skin. You measure it by how inextricable it is in everything you do. So the takeaways from today: what structures can you think about that are limiting you or others? How do they limit you or others? And how do they limit inclusion? And just a little reminder, Barbara Chow said this a number of years ago: diversity is a number. It's the sort of thing we can collect from demographic data. Inclusion is a process. As one of the previous speakers said, it's all about culture. It's all about how we treat one another and who makes the decisions about how we treat one another. And equity is an outcome. So do you go out for beers with people after work and make some decisions there? Who goes out for beers? Who can't go out for beers? Is it a good idea to go out for beers? I would say let's question everything. So that's me. I'm going to stop sharing here and pass off.
Love it, Jess. That's awesome, Jess. So we had the chance to talk about this earlier. And so I'm going to show a bit of a tool that we've been working on, but what I would really love to do is also riff off of what you've been saying too, and see if we have time for a bit of a conversation. Let's see. So the first piece that will take a little bit of time is me sharing my screen. Let's see how that goes. And I'll do it as a slideshow. Is everyone seeing it? Perfect. Thank you for the thumbs up, which I can see. So I want to say hi to everyone, and I'm really excited to be having this conversation. I've been working in sort of the concepts of inclusion most of my life. And for me, it's heart work and it's mind work, and it's also the how do we live it and bring it to life. I was struck by thank you, Lisa, for the bio. That's a bit of an older bio of mine. Right now, I'm also working with something that's called READ, which is research, education, accessibility, and design. And that's an institute that we have at Carleton University. But similar to Jess, when I say, oh yeah, I'm the assistant director of, I'm not sure quite what that means. What I get to do is work with awesome people to do some cool work around accessibility and lived experience of navigating barriers. So that's sort of the space I'm coming from today, from Carleton. So I appreciate spending a bit of time about it. So why do we even have the tool that we created? So for me, accessibility is everybody's to engage with. And I loved the way Jess was talking about, we all have responsibility and we all have opportunities. And whether that's to do that initial thinking around inclusive design, and whether we're at the space where we want to implement something, it is all of ours to share. And too often we kind of have this approach where we think that accessibility lives only with folks who are directly impacted by lived experience of navigating barriers or identifying with a disability, or that it has to be services related to. It is all of ours. And when you think about it, all of us are going to have moments in our lives where accessibility is going to be critical for us, whether that has to do with changes in our functioning because of aging, whether it's something that occurs briefly for us, whether we have something mental health related that emerges from time to time, any number of different experiences. And as Jess reminded us, we are complex human beings. We are going to be having all sorts of shifts and changes. And so what we look to push for at REIT is that accessibility becomes the norm. So when you think about that in a space, if you're a manager in a space, not requiring someone to put up their hand and saying, hey, I need this, but actually speaking about asking about what people need all the time. What are we needing to thrive and be effective together, and making that a way that a usual practice, so that we are not othering people to then have to say, oh, in this moment, I thought I was all that, I decided to try wakeboarding, I've had a concussion, now I need something. If it's normalized, so to speak, in our settings, that we continually have these discussions, that's a huge step forward around creating that in itself is an inclusive design decision about how we speak about things and how we bring them up in our settings. So the REIT initiative had a project called the David C. Onley Initiative, and we are continuing that on. And it's a collective impact strategy around how to support some better outcomes for post-secondary students in particular, but folks who are transitioning out into the employment world. And from that work, when we engaged with employers, our partners, our project found that many employers really wanted to make some strides in this area. They wanted to tap into a diversity of talent. They saw the need for this. This was not a matter of convincing people. There was actually a lot of momentum. However, those employers and businesses didn't quite know what to do about it. So what I love is that Jess is providing some of the nuanced information around what to think about and how to question ourselves as we go about these things. And then we pair that with some practical application tools. Okay, what can you do next? What are some tweaks and movements that you can start making? We also noted that small and medium businesses really needed a resource for this. Some of the larger businesses and companies might have equity-focused groups within their settings, and they could support a bit of work around that. But when we're talking about smaller businesses wanting to really up their game in accessibility, they didn't really have a resource they could start to look to, a learning resource to build their capacity. And we knew that building that knowledge and that increasing that accessibility confidence across the system was going to support that culture change that we really want to start seeing occurring. So I just put this slide up to let you know there was a lot of partners involved in developing this resource, which was a learning resource. And it was a ministry funded thing. We had post-secondaries, we had employer groupings, we had folks who were also service providers to support employment. So a lot of different stakeholders kind of informed what we created here. And we had a great team working on it too, as always, as all projects are. There's always some fantastic folks who you're not going to see the names of here, and I'm doing shout outs to them right now. They know who they are, the awesomeness that they put into all of this work. I would also say too that it's really important that we start doing shout outs and respect to where innovations come from. The idea, for instance, of captioning that many people now see in these Zoom calls and in meetings, whether you're working in a hybrid environment or however you're doing this digitally, captioning has been something that's an innovation that comes out of disability community. And just rightly pointed out, before it was like we could never work from home. Yes, actually we can. And I think mentioning that this is not something new, this has been stated from the disability community for many, many years. So respecting that piece is, I think, really important. So the pieces we felt that were really important for this tool is it needed to be something that was accessible. It absolutely had to be infused with the voice of living experience, of navigating barriers, intersectional experience. What does it mean to be navigating an employment environment? It had to be meaningful, had to be kind of effective and nimble. So a small business could use it. A business that had a team could use it. If you were working hybrid, you could use it. And it needed to also have the possibility of being individualized for a variety of different learners. Essentially, what we wanted was something that could be a catalyst for further exploration and action. Does our tool have every bit of information you'll need? Nope. Is it as nuanced as it could be? Nope, because it's meant to be a starter conversation. It's meant to be something that employers can go to when they're starting to ask the questions that Jess has put forward and see if they can find some tools that they can start with and also build that throughout their own organization. So I should say it's of course free. What does it consist of? So there are, it's basically learning modules that people can do at their own pace, or they can take them and do lunch and learns with them. It can be for managers, it can be for any employees, and it could even be something that prospective employees, job seekers could look at to say, what are employers being, what are they trying to learn about? What can I learn about when I bring in my own lived experience when I join a setting? So it's put into 4 different categories. One being starting the conversation. The next being hiring inclusively. Providing accommodations, because we point out that accommodations are only one tool of accessibility. Often people will refer to accommodations as accessibility, but accessible and inclusively designed spaces happen way before accommodations occur. And while there may always be pieces and needs for certain accommodations, because there are very complex lived experiences, they shouldn't be the first piece. They're just one element of a much more inclusive and accessible environment. But we did find from discussions with employers that they needed to know more about that and really learn what was important in that process. And then we also wanted the ideas of keeping and growing talent, right? One of my biases is when we develop a really great transition into a space, that's not the end. And it's not the person's transition, it's everybody's transition. When I join a new space, it's not just my journey that matters. I am touching other people's journeys. I am contributing to that space. And it really depends, as Jess mentioned, that context of, is that a welcoming space? Is it not? But regardless, I'm having ripple effects in that space. And so it's really important that we design our spaces so that we're keeping talent and we're growing that talent and we're allowing talent to continually inform a space. The learning resource that I'm speaking about too, which by the way, I realize I haven't said what it's called. We called it Tap Into Talent. And it's through our Able to Learn piece at Reed. So we've got sort of a full campaign around Able to, and this is one of the elements of it. We also have a piece of this learning module that is making it real. So after people have gone through all of this information, there are some toolkits that they can also utilize. So they might want to take this resource and do it at a regular staff meeting. They might want to incorporate bits of it into every staff meeting. They do an accessibility consideration where they're asking questions like Jess had put forward. That might be one piece, or where they're drawing from this learning content. So there's lots of different ways this could be utilized. This could be something when an employee is being onboarded that they start to go through. You could ask all of your managers to be starting with this. So there's all sorts of different ways that this can be utilized. It's meant to bring forward inclusion as sort of part of the everyday of work. It's meant to start to bust some of the myths. The idea of starting the conversation, we heard from employers, I'm afraid of doing harm. I don't know what to say. I'm concerned about speaking about this. So even starting to infuse language that's normally used on the everyday with inclusive language. What is welcoming? Because as Jess says, what we choose to say, what we decide to do, and what we look at measuring, those are what we're stating a value about. What I also loved about what Jess was talking about was the idea of that those unwritten rules of social communication. That's really incredibly important. Many people in our workspaces are going to have a lived experience of disability that is not apparent, not visible straight up. And one of those might be, for instance, neurodivergent thinkers. So neurodivergent thinkers may or may not be disclosing, but there may be moments where the unwritten social rules that we neurotypical folks choose not to actually articulate. Why don't we articulate those? There's a really good reason why we could just make sure that what's expected in the environment, what will be familiar to everybody, is stated. So that's just one small step that one could do around design. So I really appreciated that sort of those unwritten pieces that come into play in what Jess was saying. So this is an overview of the sections and the learning modules that are under them. I'm not going to obviously take you through them, and I'd actually really like to start chatting with Jess a little bit around how what Jess was bringing forward relates to the different sections. But as you can see, we talk about understanding and awareness and understanding inclusion and how it enriches the environment and what it can mean. We look at things like recruitment practices and interviewing processes, onboarding, all of those things. How are those done in an accessible way? Because often they're not designed in ways that are either welcoming or that actually can be effective for many folks. Even in job postings, there are many people who will self-select out because of what's in the job posting, but the job posting is not really speaking relevantly to what the job actually is. Or just even, another idea is for employers to be able to post videos of what's a day in a life in this setting, so that job applicants can have a sense of what does it look like there? What does it seem like there? Just even to build some familiarity, super important. The accommodation process is gone through as well too, and a little bit around legislation. And then it's really about continuing to build that inclusive environment to maintain and support the talent that you have. So I want to talk about something about language here. There's a big difference in saying we're doing a lot of things to support people. I was actually just on a call earlier where there's a fantastic group in Ottawa that has many neurodivergent and particularly autistic adults who are part of their company. And the difference between saying we're doing something to support you being here versus we're making sure that this environment is supportive to you because you are actually what creates a better environment. Those are two very different visions of why to engage in inclusive work. So this is not about making sure you're just helping the other. It's about actually creating spaces where you are going to be enriched as a business, as a setting, because of who you are bringing in. Here's an example of what just to give you an idea for the modules. This is our second module that we were looking at. And so someone who's engaging with this learning tool can start and go very linearly through, one step at a time, or they can go in and start looking at things that matter to them. We made sure that this was infused with lived experience and stories. For me, I think stories and sharing of our experiences and narratives, those create more aha moments, I call them, than anything else. And so we could provide you content. And I know there's many people who want to be able to dig into that and think about it and percolate it, but hearing someone's story too will sometimes lead to I never thought of that. And that's incredibly important catalyst to creating some of the change that you can get from accessing the content. So now I'd like to just kind of get into, if we have the time, the discussion for a few minutes. What I ask in the end here for you is just to consider the connections of a tool like this, based how it connects to the nuanced pieces that Jess was presenting. And what will be your first few next steps? And what elements of the tool could support you in this? And who do you want to engage in that as well too? Because this doesn't have to be a journey of just you yourself. Some of it is indeed self-reflective, but some of it I think really needs to be collaborative. I'm going to encourage you, because I didn't show it to you, to go to able2.ca, what do we call that, a / learn, and just play in the learning tool. Tap into talent, it's called. I think you'll find that there's lots of information there that will start you and give you a catalyst in terms of where you want to go next with what you're thinking about doing. You can also connect with the READ initiative if you have questions about it, or you want to kind of bring it further or want different resources as well, because this is sort of a starting point, particularly for businesses. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have a chance to just take a few minutes to talk together. I don't know if we want to do, if we have time for questions, but I know for me, the really important piece around this and what Jess was talking about was that we are continually making decisions and choices about the spaces and the places, the work we do, and who we are gathering. And that makes a difference for us. And I do realize that businesses are dealing with certain realities in certain structures. So sometimes you can't just kind of change the whole system, but there is always a way, both from starting from the self to the environment, where you can start making those changes. And a critical mass of changes does start to make impact. Jess, I don't know what your reflections are on. I realize it seems like I haven't shown you the full tool. I'm really more, this was kind of like a teaser, like everyone go see the tool. But I think I wanted to link it mostly to what you were saying, which is this is a great way to start thinking about how you might apply the concepts that Jess has been talking about.
I love the way you're talking about it, and I can't wait to start playing with it. As you said, I think play is a wonderful way to describe it. We need to engage in these things with play and a kind of a looseness and a dexterity for seeing something different and seeing something new. I also was sort of, struck. We've had a lot of moments in the last few years that have been pretty pivotal for how we think about work. We're in one right now still, where people are starting to go back to work. Businesses are starting to make decisions about how much they want to ask people to go back to work. My neighbor said to me, yeah, COVID may be winding down, but we've got a new pandemic. It's gas prices. They're disabling, right? They're a new way to make it very, very tough for some people to get to work. So it's an interesting moment, because I think that some people thought we were going back to normal, and I put that in scare quotes because normal for whom was the question. The people with disabilities who were told they couldn't have the job because they couldn't work from home, that wasn't normal. People of color who are saying, I work better at home because I find that I'm not worried about microaggressions. I'm not having to deal with the imposing sort of weight of my colleagues judging anything I say or do. I'm in my home. It's safe here. It's comforting here. I feel brave here. And this differs by person. So it's this opportunity we have to realize that work is not something that can be compartmentalized. It has to be understood within the context of our lives, our families. We've had people whose aging parents live with them during the pandemic come into Zoom calls, meeting somebody's mom, right, who they're caring for. My son will often come into my office. There was that moment where the kids came into the office during the BBC interview in South Korea that everybody thought was hilarious. Now that's become the normal. Our spaces Some people who live in 1-bedroom apartments come into Zoom rooms from their bedrooms. It's the same place. So all of these things have an impact.
They do. And they have, you know, it's funny because we've talked about how some of these changes have broken down some barriers, and some of them have, but not to forget how they can create other ones as well too. So we can't see it as a binary, as you said. For instance, there's some folks on the spectrum who have stated that the Zoom piece is really tough. It can feel very invasive, like someone is in your space, and this is a space that I've created for myself. So I liked having that separation. Or when you think about, you know, folks with, for instance, attention pieces. It's not usual that when we're in a meeting or in a classroom, for instance, if we're trying to learn, we don't see everybody. We focus on one thing. But in these types of things, when you've got gallery on, you're seeing everybody. So even teaching ourselves how to use Zoom in a way that is effective and helpful for all sorts of different learners and processors, you know, and that's, I think, really relevant for workplaces who might be saying, okay, so we've got to do hybrid, so we'll just have Zoom meetings. It's not enough to say we're just going to have Zoom meetings. We have to think about how we can make sure that everybody's contribution is getting in there for the benefit, like I'll say it in terms of that bottom line, for the benefit of that, the health of that employment setting or that business, right?
And
so that for those
weird things like policies about how to use Zoom, like everybody has to stay muted until they raise their hand, and then they do this and then they do that, and you have to have your video on. This is where these policies and the policymakers have to decide why. Is it because I said so, or is there a good reason that works for everyone?
Right. And for instance, you know, an employee having to ask for the captioning to be put on, as opposed to, why don't we just have it on every time?
Exactly.
That's the difference between, and so if folks out there are thinking, how can I start to generate a more inclusive environment or culture in my workplace? I need to learn more. I want to do more. Small pieces like that are very accessible to you. Those are something, small little tweaks, even to get that started, because that starts to generate a feel and an expectation that this is what we do.
Yes.
So I think it allows for that. One reason, and I'll just finish off here, is that we created this tool too, was to address some of the fear that we were hearing, whether that's fear of not knowing enough, fear of doing something wrong, fear of not following a legislation properly, any of those pieces. But we really felt that the employment settings were struggling because they know there's this huge talent pool out there and they need that talent pool. But what we're saying is, okay, so make sure that when you're engaging that talent pool, let's show you a little bit about how to, but also when we're engaging that talent pool, let's make sure we're on this journey all together. And it's not sort of a very specific, okay, I've gone to get a few people here, well, plunk them in and see if it works. It really does have to be something where we're engaging fully. And I think a lot of what you were talking about, Jess, does speak to that, those initial thoughts. So
yeah, and your point about not just worrying about initial onboarding, we have to create spaces where people stay, where retention is something we're concerned with, not just the tokenism of let's go get somebody from this group and onboard them in this way, but beyond the sort of excitement of bringing somebody in, what is the commitment culturally?
Thank you very much, both of you. Sorry, I'm just going to sort of jump in as the voice from above. This was an excellent conversation. I wish we could continue it, but in the interest of remaining on schedule, it is time to wrap up for the day. But thank you, Tara, and thank you, Jess. This is a very insightful conversation and sort of dual presentation to conclude the second day of our event with. I'm not going to try and summarize everything you talked about, obviously, but Jess, your comments on every decision being a design decision and what you measure as your value and how much the context matters for what people are doing really spoke to me. I do want to provide a little plug for the Able to Tap into Talent tool. It is a great place to start. It is a really good tool. I encourage people to review it. We also have a roadmap to hiring resource on the Discoverability Network website. So the two are quite complementary, and we would certainly encourage businesses to access these tools that are available to them free of cost, free of charge, I should say, in order to help them pursue these goals successfully. So thank you, Tara and Jess. And now, before we get to the final conclusion of day 2, I would like to welcome back Michelle Eaton, who is going to share some information about the OCC's continued support for business and things to look forward to with us.
Thanks so much, Donald. And just what an amazing day 2. I feel so inspired and energized, and there's so many great resources that have been and insights that have been shared. So I really just want to reiterate the Ontario Chamber of Commerce commitment to inclusion. So we're dedicated to breaking down barriers to create more inclusive workplaces, improving labor market participation for persons with disabilities. We're so delighted to host this conference to be able to talk about some of these things, but this conversation doesn't stop here. It will continue. And I think, as well said, someone said earlier, we all have responsibilities and we all have opportunities. Progress will not continue without all of our collective efforts. So our collective efforts of this group right here in this Zoom, because we know that persons with disabilities continue to face barriers. And it's something, in some of our research, and I don't think it's any secret to the folks on the call right now, that businesses are struggling to attract and retain talent. And Tara, you said it well, there's a huge talent pool out there, and we need to be engaging them all fully through all aspects of work. In our flagship report, the Ontario Economic Report, we saw that 60% of sectors are experiencing labor shortages. And some of the insights gleaned from that report actually point to how the pandemic disproportionately impacted certain sectors of the population, particularly business owners with disabilities. Then, of course, there's some sectors that were hit harder than others, such as tourism, arts, hospitality. So our policy work, our advocacy, our supports, our educational seminars will continue to focus on creating more inclusive work environments and giving the tools and resources to help other organizations do so. So please keep checking back at the Discoverability Network website or the Ontario Chamber of Commerce website, because we'll be having a number of activities coming up. The one big one I want to talk about that's coming up, that I hope you can mark your calendars for. Every year we host a summit. It's called the Ontario Economic Summit. It's taking place at the Toronto Fairmount Royal York from November 15th to 16th. And it's really about how do we build growth in Ontario, and that means having an inclusive economic growth. So I hope to see you all there. And thank you again for tuning in. I'll turn it back over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Michelle. That's great. We appreciate you sharing all that with us. So to formally conclude this conference, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to reiterate that the Discoverability Network will continue its commitment to supporting businesses to source diverse talent and successfully hire employees with a disability. I'd like to remind everyone that our trainings, workshops, events, and platform are all free to access for the benefit of all businesses. So we invite everybody here to connect with us in order to explore how we can enhance and support your recruitment efforts to address workforce needs, as well as work with any employment service providers that have attended. I know there are some, to facilitate connections between your job seekers and the businesses using the Discoverability Network. I would like to thank, or we would like to thank, not just me, the Government of Canada, without whose funding this would not have been possible. We would like to extend our gratitude to all of our speakers from both days for the time they have spent with us to share their insight and expertise, as well as the time they spent preparing for the event and making sure that everything was in order. We greatly appreciate the work of our ASL interpreters during the event, especially keeping up with my, at times, fast talking. We definitely appreciate your efforts and your patience. And finally, a sincere thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today and yesterday, certainly those who joined us over both days. We appreciate you spending your mornings with us, and we hope to see you at future events. Take care, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.